Some people are too quick to judge, and in this hospital, assumptions carry consequences beyond mere misunderstandings. Here, they don't just damage reputations, they put careers on the line. When a woman walks in expecting to be treated with the respect she's earned, but instead finds herself dismissed as if she's invisible, the truth about who she is will leave everyone stunned. Have you ever been unfairly judged? Share your experience in the comments below. The moment Vanessa Carter stepped into the hospital lobby, she felt the weight of countless eyes settling on her. But these weren't the looks that recognized her achievements or acknowledged her presence. No admiration, no curiosity. Instead, they held something else, an unspoken dismissal, a silent challenge that questioned whether she even belonged in this space. She had felt this before, seen it before. That brief hesitation, the snap judgment, the unspoken assumption lurking behind every skeptical glance. Do you even belong here? The question hovered, unspoken, but deafening. Vanessa approached the front desk, where a middle-aged white woman sat hunched over a keyboard, typing aggressively. The receptionist's long, chipped red nails clattered noisily against the keys, each tap carrying the force of irritation. She didn't bother looking up. Vanessa waited. 1 second, 2, still nothing. "Excuse me," she said, her voice smooth but unwavering. A loud sigh escaped the receptionist as if acknowledging Vanessa's presence was an exhausting task. Finally, she glanced up, her expression already brimming with impatience. "Visiting hours start at noon," she said flatly. "Come back later." Vanessa blinked. "I'm not here for visiting hours." Another sigh, heavier this time, as if Vanessa had personally disrupted her day. "Then what do you need?" Before Vanessa could answer, a passing nurse, a young blonde woman in bright pink scrubs, paused and gave her a fleeting glance. Then, as if struck by sudden realization, she stopped and turned fully toward her. "You look lost," the nurse said, offering a smile that was anything but kind. It was the kind of smile reserved for children who had wandered too far from their parents, full of condescension, wrapped in feigned politeness. "Are you looking for someone?" Vanessa kept her stance relaxed, though she felt frustration stirring beneath her calm exterior. She had spent years proving herself in spaces like these, fighting to be recognized for her worth. And yet, here she was, being treated like an outsider in a place where she had every right to stand. "I'm exactly where I need to be," Vanessa said evenly. "I was actually looking for—" Before she could finish, a security guard approached. His name tag read, Officer Mendez, and his posture exuded the rigid authority of a man who prided himself on enforcing the rules, especially when it came to keeping the wrong people out of the right places. "Everything all right here?" Mendez asked, his gaze sweeping over Vanessa with scrutiny. His stance shifted slightly, broadening as if preparing for confrontation. The receptionist barely contained her smirk. "She seems confused about where she is." Vanessa met Mendez's gaze directly, refusing to shrink beneath his unearned authority. "I'm not confused." Mendez crossed his arms, making a deliberate effort to appear even larger. "You sure about that?" he asked, skepticism dripping from every syllable. "Because," he continued, his tone laced with quiet challenge, "you're standing in the middle of the front desk like you don't know where you're supposed to be." During the hospital's busiest hours, the air thick with movement and voices, yet somehow nobody seemed to understand why Vanessa was there. She took a slow, measured breath. This wasn't new, not at all. She had felt this same sting of dismissal as a medical student, endured it as a resident, and even battled it as a fully licensed physician. But this would be the last time. Her voice, steady and deliberate, sliced through the air like a blade. "I'm here because this is my hospital." Officer Mendez let out a short, disbelieving scoff, his eyes flicking toward the receptionist and the nurse as if they all shared some inside joke, one Vanessa hadn't been invited to. "I don't think so," he said, arms crossed, his stance screaming authority. Vanessa tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "That's interesting," she said, her voice sharp and unwavering, "because the hospital board seems to think otherwise." The laughter that had been forming in Mendez's throat died before it had a chance to escape. The nurse, whose condescending smirk had been so effortless just moments ago, took a half-step back, uncertainty creeping into her expression. The receptionist, who had barely looked at Vanessa minutes before, suddenly appeared restless in her seat, as if realizing, too late, that something had shifted. Vanessa didn't move, didn't blink, didn't offer them an escape. "I don't think you understand who I am," she continued, her voice smooth as steel. The receptionist swallowed hard, the first to sense the shift in power. "Look, ma'am, Dr. Vanessa Carter," she interrupted, her words landing like a gavel's final strike. "Chief of Medicine." The impact was immediate. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. The nurse's face flushed a deep shade of crimson. The receptionist's eyes widened behind her glasses, her mouth slightly open as if forming an apology she couldn't quite say. And Mendez, the security guard who had been so certain she was in the wrong place, now looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. Vanessa let them sit with their shame, allowing the weight of their own actions to crush them. Then a voice from behind her broke the silence. "Doctor! Carter!" A tall man in a sharply tailored navy blue suit strode toward her, a warm, easy smile on his face as he extended his hand. Dr. Malcolm Reese, the hospital's director, a man who actually knew who she was. Vanessa took his hand in a firm, confident shake. "I hope they've been treating you well," Dr. Reese said, his voice light but laced with something unspoken. The receptionist let out a nervous, awkward laugh. The nurse opened her mouth, then quickly shut it. Mendez took a step back, suddenly fascinated by the tile beneath his feet. Vanessa's lips curled into a knowing smile. "They've been accommodating." Dr. Reese chuckled, gesturing toward the hallway. "Let's get you up to the boardroom. Everyone's eager to meet you." "Of course," Vanessa said smoothly, but not before glancing back at the trio whose confidence had crumbled into regret. She didn't need to say anything else. They already knew. As she followed Dr. Reese toward the elevators, she felt their eyes burning into her back. But this time it wasn't judgment. It wasn't dismissal. It was fear. It was regret. And most importantly, for the first time, it was power. The same people who had brushed her aside, who had treated her as invisible, were now sitting in a boardroom waiting to meet their new chief of medicine. But when Vanessa walked in, their confidence dissolved like sugar in water. How would they react now, knowing the woman they had ignored was the one holding the authority they once thought was theirs to control? Vanessa walked down the gleaming corridor, her heels clicking against the pristine floors, each step deliberate, unwavering. The tension from the front desk still lingered behind her like an echo, but she was done looking back. There were more important things ahead. The boardroom loomed before her. Double doors of polished wood, an emblem of power and leadership. Inside sat the decision-makers, the ones who held the hospital's future in their hands. Some had heard her name before, read her research in prestigious medical journals, perhaps even seen her at conferences. But most had no idea. No idea that she was a black woman, and that had always been the problem. Dr. Reese pushed the doors open, stepping inside first. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced with a bright, confident smile, "allow me to introduce our new chief of medicine, Dr. Vanessa Carter." The reaction was instant. The air in the room shifted. She had seen this before, the quick recalculations, the realization that their assumptions had betrayed them. Some, like Dr. Gregory Langston, an older white man who had held unchecked power for years, barely concealed their shock. His fingers tightened around the armrest of his chair, his expression a careful mask of neutrality. Others, like Dr. Sophia Patel, who had already been aware of Vanessa's appointment, nodded in approval. But the best reactions? Those came from the very people who had dismissed her just minutes ago. The receptionist, who had treated her like an inconvenience, was now moving through the room, stiff-shouldered, pouring water for the board members, her hands trembling slightly. The young nurse, who had offered her a patronizing smile in the lobby, now stood against the wall, eyes darting between the real power players in the room, suddenly very aware of her insignificance. and Mendez, the security guard who had all but tried to escort her out. He stood near the exit, silent, uneasy, his presence no longer carrying the same weight. Vanessa didn't rush to speak. She didn't offer them an easy way out. Instead, she walked slowly, deliberately, to the head of the table and took her seat. "I'd like to start by thanking Dr. Reese and the hospital board for entrusting me with this role," she said, her voice smooth and controlled. "It is a privilege to lead this institution and to uphold the highest standard of medical care." The board members nodded, some offering polite, if forced smiles. But Vanessa wasn't done. "Before we discuss policies and future initiatives," she continued, her gaze sweeping the room, razor-sharp and unyielding, "I want to make something very clear." She let the silence hang, heavy and unrelenting. "When I walked into this hospital today, I was treated with disrespect." A ripple of discomfort moved across the table. The receptionist froze mid-pour, nearly spilling the water in her hand. Mendez shifted near the wall, suddenly fascinated with the floor again. "I was dismissed, ignored, and at one point security was called on me for nothing more than standing at the front desk." Dr. Langston cleared his throat, his voice tight. "Dr. Carter, I'm sure it was just a misunderstanding. Our staff is trained to ensure only authorized personnel." Vanessa held up a hand, silencing him. "A misunderstanding would be one person making an error," she said evenly, her tone like tempered steel. "But when the receptionist, a nurse, and security all participate in that error, it's not a misunderstanding. It's a pattern." Silence. Dr. Reese remained still, watching, letting the weight of the truth settle. Vanessa leaned forward. "If that's how I was treated as a doctor and your new chief of medicine, what does that tell me about how our patients, especially those who don't fit a certain expectation, are being treated?" The question landed like a hammer. Some board members averted their eyes. Others looked guilty. Dr. Patel, one of the few who had been genuinely excited about Vanessa's arrival, finally spoke up. "This is a conversation we need to have, because if this happened to Dr. Carter, it's happening to others." Vanessa nodded. "And that brings me to my first initiative." As the new chief of medicine, Vanessa Carter reached into her sleek leather briefcase, retrieving a thick folder brimming with documents. She placed it on the polished boardroom table with deliberate precision, her gaze unwavering. "Effective immediately, this hospital will implement a mandatory bias training program for all employees," she announced, her voice steady and resolute. "Doctors, nurses, administrative staff, security, everyone." A ripple of murmurs spread across the room. Dr. Langston, his expression a mask of thinly veiled resistance, leaned forward. "Is that really necessary?" Vanessa met his eyes without hesitation, her stare piercing through his doubt. "You tell me, Dr. Langston," she said smoothly, "because from where I stood this morning it is absolutely necessary." Langston shifted uncomfortably, his fingers tightening against the armrests of his chair, but he said nothing. Vanessa allowed the silence to settle before continuing. "This training is not optional. Failure to complete it will result in disciplinary action. In addition, we are introducing a mystery patient program, an anonymous evaluation of patient interactions. If this hospital is to call itself one of the best, then we must ensure that every single person who walks through these doors is treated like they belong here." The room grew eerily still. A hushed uncertainty replaced the earlier whispers. Vanessa leaned back, her presence undeniable. "I take my position seriously," she said, "and I expect everyone in this hospital to do the same." Across the table, the faces of those who had belittled her just hours ago were now stark with unease. Mendez, the security guard who had been so quick to dismiss her, cast his gaze downward. The receptionist, who had looked at her like an inconvenience, averted her eyes. The nurse, who had smirked at her now, merely nodded, her previous arrogance utterly dismantled. "I understand that change makes people uncomfortable," Vanessa continued, her voice carrying an unmistakable finality. "But change is here, whether you're ready or not. And if you cannot uphold the values of this hospital, then this may not be the place for you." Silence. The weight of her words pressed into every corner of the boardroom. Then Dr. Reese smiled. "Well said, Dr. Carter." Vanessa clasped her hands together. "Now," she said, "let's talk about what's next for this hospital." By the time she stepped out of that room, the energy in the building had shifted. The same people who had questioned her presence now scrambled to avoid her gaze. They knew exactly who she was, and they knew she wasn't going anywhere. 2 days later, the first sign of resistance came in the form of an email. Vanessa had been reviewing patient reports when she saw it, Dr. Langston's name flashing in her inbox. "Dr. Carter, it has come to my attention that certain new policies regarding hospital training are being implemented rather hastily. Given my years of experience on this board, I believe we should consider slowing the process to ensure a smoother transition. I'd be happy to discuss this further over lunch." Vanessa leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. She had expected this. Langston wasn't outright defying her, not yet. He was testing the waters, probing to see if she would compromise, if she would hesitate, if her authority could be chipped away. She responded with a single sentence, "Dr. Langston, I appreciate your concerns, but the changes are already in motion. We will not be slowing down. No debate. No lunch. No negotiation." By the following week, Langston had resigned. While some resisted, others were forced to confront the truth. Vanessa called a private meeting with the receptionist, the nurse, and Mendez, the 3 individuals who had dismissed her on her first day. The receptionist sat stiffly, her hands clasped together, her eyes fixed on the table. The nurse chewed on the inside of her cheek, the bravado she had once displayed completely absent. But Mendez sat with his arms crossed, his body language defensive, his expression unreadable. Vanessa tapped her pen against the table, studying them for a long moment. "I want to ask you all a question," she said. "How do you think I felt when I walked into this hospital and was treated like I didn't belong?" Silence. The receptionist swallowed. I guess it must have been frustrating." Vanessa nodded. "Frustrating is one word. Humiliating is another. Disappointing is another." The nurse exhaled. "Dr. Carter, I didn't mean anything by it. I just assumed—" "That's the problem," Vanessa interrupted, her tone sharp but measured. "You assumed—" The nurse dropped her gaze. Vanessa turned to Mendez. "You were ready to escort me out of the building. Do you understand what that means?" Mendez inhaled deeply, his jaw tightening. "I was just doing my job." "No," Vanessa corrected. "You were abusing your job. Your job is to protect this hospital, not to assume that a black woman standing at the front desk is a problem that needs to be removed." Mendez clenched his fists but remained silent. Vanessa folded her hands. "Here's how this will work. You will all complete the bias training twice. You will be personally reviewed for the next 3 months." The receptionist nodded quickly. "Of course, I understand." The nurse exhaled, nodding. Mendez hesitated, just for a moment. Then he gave a sharp nod, his expression unreadable. Vanessa met his gaze. "If you can't handle that, you can hand in your badge now." Mendez didn't move, but he didn't argue either. "You're dismissed." They left, and Vanessa finally exhaled, one battle at a time. Weeks passed, and the shift became undeniable. The bias training was more than just another initiative. It was a reckoning. At first, staff grumbled, some resisted, but nobody wanted to be on the wrong side of history. The culture of the hospital began to change. Patients noticed. Black and brown patients, who had once been ignored or dismissed, now received better care. Doctors and nurses checked their biases, knowing their actions were being watched. Even security changed. Mendez, though still reserved, began thinking before acting, and at the center of it all was Vanessa Carter. She hadn't just changed policies. She had changed the very way people saw leadership. One afternoon, as she made her rounds, she noticed a young black woman in scrubs standing at the front desk, her shoulders tense. An older white doctor was speaking to her, skepticism heavy in his voice. "You're here for an interview?" he asked. "Yes," the woman replied, "for the residency program." Vanessa knew that tone. She had heard it before. Stepping forward, she spoke smoothly. "Everything all right here?" The doctor turned, startled. "Dr. Carter, I was just speaking with—" "I know," Vanessa interrupted. "I'd be happy to personally escort our residency candidate to her interview." The young woman exhaled, relief flooding her expression. Vanessa smiled. "Not today," she thought. "Not in my hospital." As she led the young woman down the corridor, she knew that one day she would walk these halls as a doctor, without ever having to wonder if she belonged. 3 months later, Vanessa sat at the head of the boardroom table. Dr. Reese smiled. "I think it's safe to say that since Dr. Carter's arrival, this hospital has undergone significant change." Some nodded. Others remained silent, but none could deny it. Vanessa sat back, completely at ease. The message was clear. She hadn't just taken this position. She had transformed it. The days of doubt, dismissal, and disrespect were over. She was exactly where she belonged,